Здравейте! Днешната лекция ще бъде посветена на идеите и концепциите на корейската философия Juche. Тя ще бъде основно на английски, затова по този момент тя ще бъде изцяло на английски заради нашия гост. Така че нека да започнем. Hello everybody! Let's start our presentation about the ideas of the Juche philosophy. We will make introduction to these ideas, and here we invited our guest, who is really big specialist about this topic. This is Dr. Hudson. He is chairman of Korean Friendship Association of UK, and today he is going to make a short introduction to this topic. Let's see.
Right, thank you for the nice introduction. I'm very honoured to be here tonight to meet you all. And Bulgaria is a very beautiful country, very nice country, so I'm very pleased to be here and to meet you all and to talk about the Juche idea, which I've now been a Juche idea follower for nearly 35 years. I first became interested in the Juche idea during the 1980s, and it gripped me as a strongly imaginative idea, revolutionary idea, and of course an idea that's about independence. And I'll perhaps speak a little bit later about how I came to Juche. As Comrade Stoyan said, I'm chairman of the UK Korean Friendship Association. I'm also chairman of the Juche Study Group of England. I've actually visited the DPRK 17 times, not enough times I think, but 17, which is, you know, it's fair going. And unlike some so-called experts on the DPRK, I've actually been to the DPRK, because when you look at the internet or go to a university library, you'll find works written about the DPRK by so-called experts. None of them have actually ever set foot there. That is a fact. They've not set foot in the place. So, you know, they're basically often recycling second-hand propaganda by the Americans, by the Seoul regime from Japan, and so on. So, you know, I've actually been to the DPRK. First time was in May 1992, and the last time was actually in April of this year, where I was there with Comrade Stoyan, and also with my daughter, who was visiting the DPRK for the first time. And I think it's honest to say, I think you know, throughout the world, young people are becoming more and more interested in the Juche idea in all countries. That's a fact. And our Korean Friendship Association, we have the delegate from KFA Italy present tonight, has 17,000 members throughout the whole world, and we're starting new branches up all the time. There's 1,000 Juche idea study groups in the world. The first one was started in the West African country of Mali in 1969. There's the International Institute for the Study of the Juche idea, and of course the European Regional Society for the Study of the Juche idea, which is holding the European Regional Seminar on the Juche idea tomorrow, which is why, you know, I've made the journey to your country. So, what is Juche? Perhaps one of the best ways to start is by trying to explain what it is not. Quite often, Juche isn't simply mentioned, it's blanked out completely. Again, some of these people writing about, some of these journalists, they will write huge articles about the DPRK, not mention Juche once, which just shows how ignorant they are. Because Juche is the guiding ideology of the DPRK and has guided the DPRK for many, over 7 decades, and has led the DPRK to make huge achievements. Yet, they don't mention Juche at all. So this is one sort of negative form of propaganda. Some other specialists and newspapers will just tell you that Juche simply means self-reliance. That, of course, is how Juche is applied in practical policy, but it's much more than that. And I remember 2 years ago, in 2017, when the tension between the DPRK and the US was very tense, and Trump was talking about fire and fury. The British daily paper, tabloid paper, which sells millions of copies and is read by working class people, the Daily Mirror, which is like a right-wing social democratic paper, carried an article about the DPRK. And it said, Juche is, and I quote, go-it-alone nationalism combined with Marxism. And to me, that's a gross distortion, a gross misunderstanding of what Juche is about. President Kim Il-sung, Chairman Kim Jong-il, and Marshal Kim Jong-un never ever used the words, we must go it alone. Juche is actually quite internationalist, and DPRK itself has diplomatic relations with many countries. It's a member of different international organisations. It's given a lot of support to the different liberation struggles in many parts of the world. Like, for example, during the Vietnam War, they sent KPA pilots to Vietnam to assist the Vietnamese people with the 1973 war, Middle East War. They sent KPA pilots to fly with the Egyptian Air Force fighting against the Israeli Zionist aggressors. So, in fact, the DPRK has profoundly internationalist nature, and it has a very good internationalist record. And it was stressed that in fact that the struggle of the world people for independence is an international one, not just within a single country. And I've always found that when some people talk about nationalism, it is because they don't like small countries asserting their identity, their independence. So it becomes, some big countries, when a small country asserts its independence, it becomes a problem, and they start talking about nationalism, like in the UK. For example, many Scottish people want Scotland to be independent. So, some people have been complaining about Scottish nationalism, narrow Scottish nationalism, so on. But, they don't talk about countries like the UK and the US and some other Western countries which dominate the world, which dominate international forums like the UN You know, they don't see this kind of nationalism as a problem. It's only when the small man, the small country stands up for himself that it becomes a problem. So, Juche is a Korean word, and the Korean alphabet, each character represents a syllable. And so the word Ju, Ju, means master, and J means oneself. So it simply means master of oneself. And President Kim Il-sung created the Juche ideology during the anti-Japanese struggle. He became very acutely aware that for Korea to gain independence, they must rely on the people, because you had some Korean nationalists who wanted to just write petitions calling for independence from Japan. They wanted to appeal to the US and to other big countries to help them get independence from Japan, but none of them thought of the idea of actually relying on the Korean people to achieve independence. And similarly, you had communist groups in Korea, but they were actually led by people from the middle class, from the bourgeoisie, and they too were divorced from the masses, and they believed in each factional group sending its representatives to the Comintern and asking for approval. But instead, President Kim Il-sung, he formed a core of young revolutionaries around him, and he first started the Down with Imperialism Union on 17th October 1926. And the Juche idea was basically outlined a meeting of young Korean revolutionaries at Kowloon in China. And I would just explain that the fact was that during Japanese rule of Korea, many Koreans were exiled in China, but actually forced out of Korea by the severity of Japanese rule. So they lived in China and they organised themselves in China. So anyway, President Kim Il-sung outlined the Juche idea at that meeting, and the term Juche was first used by President Kim Il-sung at a meeting of propagandists of the Workers' Party of Korea in December 1955, when he talked about the need to break with any kind of sycophancy towards big powers, to not copy other countries like the Soviet Union, and basically said Juche is the Korean Revolution. Later, Chairman Kim Jong-il developed the Juche idea in depth and systematised it, and he wrote the famous thesis in March 1982, just called On the Juche Idea. And I would strongly recommend reading that book, and you will see that in fact Juche goes far beyond simple self-reliance. The Juche idea, the central concept, is the idea that the people, popular masses, are the masters of the revolutionary construction, and they must take responsibility for it. It's basically, to me, it's always been an idea of empowerment, an idea of liberation, and the central, the philosophical basis of the Juche idea is that man is the master of everything and decides everything. And that, of course, rejects any kind of idea that, you know, there's a supernatural deity controlling man's destiny. You know, man controls destiny, his own destiny himself. I mean, it's basically a material, in the philosophical sense of the word, it's a materialistic theory, you know, like Marxism and Leninism is. Only with Juche, it puts stress on the subjective factors rather than objective factors, because Marxism and Leninism tended to emphasise material and economic factors, but didn't really emphasise the role of the people in the revolution. And Juche defines man as having three essential characteristics: independence, creativity and consciousness, and these are all interrelated. Because to be creative, man needs to be independent, needs to be conscious of his position in the world to display independence and creativity. And it should also be, I think, an important point here is that these are actually social attributes. You know, they're not natural attributes. I mean, when we say that man has these three features, we're not saying that everybody is automatically born with them. You know, that's inborn. These come about as a result of, you know, man's social role, you know, the role of man as a social being. You know, only within society can man display these features. So that's the philosophical side of it. Now, when we look at the practical application of Juche, the most important factor is to establish Juchean ideology, and then independence in politics, that is political independence, and you know, you can see that in the policies of the DPRK, which in my opinion has always been the most independent country in the world. And even one reactionary ex-British Prime Minister, John Major, when speaking about the European referendum, he said, "Oh, North Korea, that's an example of undiluted independence. You know, if you're voting to leave the European Union, you're going to be doing what North Korea did." And in a sense, I agree with John Major. It is, is undiluted independence, and throughout its existence, the DPRK has pursued an independent policy. And for example, when there was a split amongst the socialist countries between China and the Soviet Union, both countries were asking, they were demanding that other socialist countries took their side, and many countries sided with the Soviet Union, and one or two with China, but the DPRK was independent of both and managed to maintain good relations with both countries despite the intense political conflict between those countries. And in recent years we've seen how the DPRK demonstrated its independence by its missile program and its nuclear program, which it carried out in defiance of the US and the UN. So that's, these are practical examples of independence. And then you have self-sufficiency or self-support in the economy, which is dubbed as self-reliance in the media, and this is very important because, as I think we all know, the economy is the material base of everything. And if you don't have an independent economy, you can't have political independence because you become dependent on other countries for finance, for fuel, and so on. And in turn, they can say, well, if you don't follow such and such policy, we won't sell you oil, or we won't lend you money. They can determine the country's policies that way. And the third feature is self-reliance in national defence, which again is interlinked with the first two features and supports them because the aggressive nature of imperialism does not change. So it's incumbent on a country to develop its own strong self-defensive forces to defend its independence, to defend its revolution, because without its own independent armed forces, cannot guarantee its existence or its independence. And we saw in recent years how some countries that were militarily weak, like Yugoslavia, like Libya, Iraq, Afghanistan, and so on, all got attacked by the US, but the DPRK didn't. And now you have a US president who's desperate to talk to the DPRK, desperate to do a deal with them. And why? Because he knows that if the US started a war with the DPRK, they would lose it. That's why he really wants to talk to the DPRK, because he knows that the US would lose in a war. And similarly, US anti-DPRK policies, because of the application of Juche, the US has reached a dead end. They can't militarily attack the DPRK. They've applied sanctions after sanctions after sanctions until they're nearly at the level where they've run out of actually things to sanction in the DPRK. And the sanctions are failing because the DPRK has the Juche idea, has the independent national economy. So the sanctions do not have any effect on the DPRK. So that's the philosophical basis of the Juche idea and how it's applied in real, in actual terms of day-to-day policies. And in building a new society, Juche stresses the role of ideology, and that comes back to this whole concept that the people are the masters of the revolution construction, and they've got the responsibility to carry it out. So, the DPRK basically has the ideological revolution, and they put strong emphasis on ideology rather than, simple material incentives, which of course exist in the DPRK, but the primary emphasis is on ideology, and it's because of this whole concept of the subjective factor. So, I think I've given a sort of fair, a good summary of the Juche idea, and as Dr. Vishnov, who used to be the Director General of the International Institute of the Juche idea, says, study the Juche idea. It will cost you nothing, but it will pay in plenty. And I think if you look at the experience of the DPRK, which emerged from being a colony of Japan, being ruled by colonialism and feudalism, and then was bombed heavily by the US, and it was able to reconstruct itself completely, and is now like building new streets every year. I think you can see how successful the Juche idea is, and I hope if you have the money, don't just take my word for it. Go and visit the DPRK yourself and see it for yourself, because seeing is believing. Thank you for listening.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
So now it is the part where we can ask questions about the introduction of the philosophy and what you really want to ask. What was...
I have a question because Juche originates from Asia, and in Asia, in most of the philosophies that I know about, it's they are much more focused on the society, so they are like collectivist mindset. They have that. It's in Japan, in China, in India, they have this collectivist mindset, while in the West we are more or less like individualistic mindset. And as you said, in Juche, people are the masters of their own fate. So is it that they are collectively master of their environment, or is it that each individual is a master of his or her own life?
Well, it's collectively.
It's collective.
But the individual is part of the whole.
Mm-hmm.
That's how the role of the individual is seen under Juche. Of course, Juche rejects the extreme individualism of Western societies, which I think are becoming more and more individualistic and atomised all the time.
And when there is a conflict between two people who follow the Juche philosophy, how is it resolved? Is it like a policy of how to resolve conflicts or make decisions collectively?
Well, that would be resolved through the democratic decision-making processes within the DPRK, because at all levels in the DPRK you've got the Supreme People's Assembly, which is the only law-making body at national level, and then you've got People's Assemblies at provincial level, county level, town level, district level, and in every workplace people take part in discussions and decision making. So these conflicts between people would be decided in that way.
I have kind of a similar question, or at least a similar topic. From what you described so far, more or less the framework, I guess, would be the proper word. The framework, based on your examples, is more or less on the international level, or on country level, or on governmental level. If this philosophy, how does it apply to the individual? say if like is it are we talking about some kind of abstraction, talking about the state, the different forms of governance, or is it applied more as an individual mindset? For example, Hegelianism, you can have different readings of the dialectical process, whether it's at an individual level, at a national level, if you want, or even some kind of historical level, the leaps of history. So what would be the individual framework on this philosophy? Like if I want to assert independence and so on, as an individual as opposed to as a nation. Like, does this make sense? I'm not sure.
It makes sense in one way, but the whole point about Juche is that the individual is part of a socio-political collective. I mean, it's true that the individual, may have, his own interests and tastes, but he still needs to unite with the community, with everyone else, and when you talk about individual independence, some might sort of see that in a very negative way, meaning that it's an individual being antisocial, rejecting society. But that is strongly rejected by Juche. But I mean, to try and give practical examples, when I've say been to the DPRK 17 times, and I've had different guides, and everyone sort of comes over as an individual. It's not like the Western media try to say it's a nation of robots. Everybody supports the Juche idea, they support the Workers' Party, they're building socialism. But within that framework, people, will have different tastes, different styles. There's one, I don't know how familiar people are here with sort of DPRK cinema and films. Okay, not at all, right? One film, I think Jean-Claude might know it, called Case is Closed, a spy film from the DPRK. And I had one sort of young woman as a guide, and I asked about buying it. And she thought, yes, very good film. Oh, I really like that film, it's a great film. So anyway, bought the film anyway. Another guide, bit older than the first one, he was actually a university teacher. When I mentioned the film to her, she said, oh, I don't like that film. I said, why? Oh, I don't like that actress in it. So, that gives you an example of what individuality. But both of those people would say, yes, they supported the Juche idea, yes, they supported Marshal Kim Jong-un, yes, they supported socialism.
Yeah, my idea was like, maybe I didn't explain properly. The idea is, if we say, from what you were saying, say the idea, because I understood independence, what was that? Creativity
and consciousness.
and consciousness. Okay, great. Let's say at a community level, this makes sense. This your introduction makes sense. But would this make like the scale? If we take a different scale, like to take it one step up would be world scale. To take it one step down would be one person. Say today I want to follow this philosophy. How will I do it in my own framework of existence?
Well, yeah, like you say, you can't, you know, I suppose you could start by reading about the Juche idea, but you know, you'd have to become part of an association or a study group, because you know, really only collectivism achieves results. And I think the idea of the completely individual man is an illusory concept. And to try and give you an example here, I don't know whether what I'm going to say makes sense. Perhaps one or two of you have read or seen perhaps film versions of the story of Robinson Crusoe by the British writer Daniel Defoe. And that book, you know, you're given the impression of, you know, because he's shipwrecked on an island, and for a long time he's only there by himself, and then he finds another man who he calls Friday. And the idea was that this was an individual battling against nature, and, you know, I think he builds his own house and so on. But when you analyse it, in reality, Robinson is an Englishman from England. He's grown up in English society, and the skills that he uses to build a house and so on, he's actually acquired them when he's actually been living in England, and he's just applying that knowledge and those skills. And, you know, if he'd been born apart from society, he wouldn't have those skills. And trying to remember this, I mean, you know, I've seen this story in different books, and some of the DPRK books use this story of, I think it was in India, of how a human child was raised by wolves, and finally, you know, they found the child and tried to bring him back into human society, but they found, you know, he didn't know how to eat at a table. You know, he wanted to eat on the floor and tear the food with his mouth. He couldn't speak. And it took a very long time before they could actually just teach the child to do some very basic things. And the reason why was because he'd been apart from human society. So, you know, that brings me back to the point, you know, collectivism is really the only way. And, you know, when man first evolved, you know, he started to conquer nature by, you know, forming collectives, by forming tribes. And, you know, people couldn't survive without being in a group of other people.
Is it possible to apply Juche within a family or within like a housing complex?
I think this is more or less an example.
Or when you go back to Britain, you're from Britain, right?
Yes, yes.
So yeah, there you can meet with people who share these ideas. Can you build a community and follow some kind of alternative way of living within Britain, of course following the British laws, and still follow the Juche ideas instead of just reading or talking about them, just do them in practice where you live within such a community. Is it possible, or does it need a state and higher level resources and freedoms and independence in order to follow the philosophy?
I would say it would need to be at state level, because otherwise, if it's just one group of people applying Juche within a small community, then it's just apart from the rest of society, and that's not what we're really aiming at. And I think in the UK and one or two other countries, I think the experience when I think different religious groups and some political groups tried this sort of thing, and they formed communes. I think the experience was very negative, particularly when some Maoists formed a commune in South London. That ended very badly. So I think we wouldn't really be considering something like that. But for the time being, how we apply it is by forming study groups and societies. Well, of course, there are many ways in which we can expand our work, and by creating all sorts of different activities. And I think some Juche idea study groups in the world they have cultural events as well as political and ideological events. So it is sort of going a bit beyond sort of simple reading books or seminars. Is going into other areas of life.
But as far as I understand, this means that actually Juche is in part nationalistic, because the country relies on itself after all, and it's not like depending on other countries for something. So it's more nationalistic than internationalistic, right?
No, I'd say Juche stresses both national duties and international duties, and I think particularly with the concept of the independent economy, President Kim Il-sung specifically said we're not looking for autarky, which means an economic model where a country produces everything for itself, which I think was advocated by some fascist theorists and some Islamic theorists. What the DPRK's self-reliance aims at doing is maximising the use of the resources they've got and rejecting subordination and dependence. It doesn't mean extreme nationalism. And the DPRK has always been part of an international movement, and as I said at the beginning of my talk, it's actually given quite a lot of international assistance to other countries, and at the same time it is also a member of a lot of international organisations, a lot of UN bodies. It's active in them, like the World Health Organization, like UNESCO. So it doesn't mean sort of like extreme nationalism or shutting the door.
How about unions? Would a country following the Juche philosophy form a union with another country that follows the Juche or maybe similar philosophy, like for example Cuba or Iran? they also want to be completely independent, why not form something like a union or partnership with these countries?
Well, certainly, I mean, there are partnerships. I mean, there's bilateral agreements, but DPRK's always, I think, avoided actual unions or blocs. But I mean, it's got very strong, very close relations with Cuba. Cuban president was in the DPRK last November, and there's a lot of cooperation between DPRK and Cuba, and also between the DPRK and Syria, DPRK and Iran, and some African countries in the DPRK, though unfortunately the US tried to interfere in that and tried to persuade some African countries to break their cooperation with the DPRK and to shut the door to the DPRK.
What about trade unions? Because he said unions, and I'm curious.
In the DPRK you've got the General Federation of Trade Unions of Korea, which represents, I think, most industrial and office workers. There's agricultural working people that have a separate organisation, and there's also unions for writers and artists as well. The Trade Union Federation goes right back to the days of the anti-Japanese armed struggle, when President Kim Il-sung actually formed an anti-Japanese labour union amongst power station workers. And the General Federation of Trade Unions was formed in 1946.
So there is a trade between North Korea and Cuba. Like the government of both countries decide how to trade, and they don't impose each other tariffs or try to block the trade between Cuba and North Korea, if we take these two countries as an example. Some kind of cooperation.
That's correct, and it's actually a lot deeper than that. For example, the DPRK was given Cuba help with building hydroelectric energy power stations, for example. And I think this goes back a few years, but Cuban basketball and Cuban volleyball specialists went to DPRK to train volleyball players and basketball players.